Hello, my dear friends. Some wedding nights end with roses, some start with blood. They call it love, but it's actually duty, fear, and sometimes a wound that never heals. No one tells you about the brides who tremble in the bridal chamber as if they were about to enter an operating table. No one mentions the silence that weighs like a stone on their chest for a lifetime. Tonight, let me walk you into the cold, silent truth of a Victorian wedding night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into the private chambers of a Victorian home on the evening before a wedding, the scene would feel less like a celebration and more like a ritual. The bride was not treated as a woman preparing for the happiest night of her life, but as an object to be purified and readied for sacrifice. She was taken to be bathed, her body washed with rose water and milk, a process that was said to cleanse her of past thoughts or hidden desires. Servants prepared the water carefully, and attendants ensured no detail was overlooked. This cleansing was not about comfort or care, it was about stripping away any sense of individuality. The bride was expected to emerge as a figure of untouched purity, no longer herself, but a symbol of family honour. After the bath, she was dressed in stark white undergarments, chosen not for comfort but for meaning. White was meant to represent innocence, chastity, and submission. The layers of fabric were stiff and plain, leaving no room for self-expression. The garments were carefully checked, adjusted, and approved by family members or attendants. The symbolism mattered more than the girl wearing them. Even the smallest hint of personal choice was erased in the name of purity. It is almost absurd to imagine how much effort went into proving something that could never truly be measured. Yet in Victorian homes, this was treated with utmost seriousness. The bride was not alone during these preparations. She was watched constantly, her every move observed by chaperones or family servants. Privacy was denied to her, as though her very presence carried the risk of corruption. Attendants were tasked with ensuring that she did not attempt anything improper before the ceremony. To modern eyes, it seems cruel, even laughable, that a young woman needed guards to protect her from supposed misbehaviour in her final hours of freedom. Yet in the rigid moral structure of the era, this surveillance was considered necessary. If we compare this to today, it would be like forcing a bride to go through airport-level security checks before her wedding night. An invasion so extreme, it turns a private event into a public inspection. The room itself reflected the same cold purpose. Curtains were drawn to block outside light. Candles burned dimly to create an atmosphere of restraint, and even mirrors were often covered to prevent vanity. The bride was guided through each step with solemn silence. No laughter was permitted, no personal joy allowed. What should have been a moment of intimacy was transformed into a ceremonial duty. The symbolism of sacrifice hung in the air, reminding everyone present that this was not a celebration of love but an offering to family honour and social expectation. The people around her reinforced the weight of the ritual. Mothers, aunts, or hired attendants oversaw the details, whispering reminders of purity and obedience. Their faces were stern, their voices sharp, their presence unyielding. They did not comfort the bride, they instructed and corrected her. This was not about her feelings, but about her role. She was being moulded into what society demanded, whether she was ready or not. I cannot help but find it chilling to imagine a young girl enduring this process. Her body scrubbed and her spirit pressed into silence, all under the watchful eyes of strangers. This preparation was deeply tied to the obsession with appearances. The Victorians cared more about what could be seen and judged than what was actually felt or lived. A spotless gown, a spotless body, A spotless reputation, these were worth more than the truth. The ritual was less about the bride herself, and more about the family presenting her as untouched property. She was expected to embody purity, whether or not she understood what that meant. The act of bathing in rosewater and milk may sound gentle, but in context, it was another way of erasing her individuality. She was not treated as a person with feelings or desires, but as a symbol of her family's reputation. Behind the closed doors of those homes, the preparation was strict, but outside, the community whispered and speculated. Neighbours and relatives waited to see signs of virtue confirmed. The pressure extended beyond the household walls, as every detail could become fuel for gossip. A misstep, a rumour, or even an absence of ritual could destroy a reputation. Families followed these customs not only out of belief, but out of fear of judgment. The weight of society's gaze reached into the most private corners of life, shaping even the way a young bride was bathed and dressed for her wedding night. The symbolism of sacrifice made itself clear in the atmosphere. Everything about the process suggested that something was being offered up. The bride was placed in a role she could not refuse, her body and her identity stripped away for the sake of tradition. The repetition of these rituals reinforced the idea that she belonged not to herself, but to her family and soon to her husband. The purity was not hers to hold, it was theirs to display. To the Victorians, this was not cruelty but duty, a practice woven so tightly into their moral code that no one questioned it openly. To question it was to question the order of society itself. The cruelty lay not only in the act but in its acceptance. Girls were told this was normal. Mothers repeated the same rituals they had endured, and servants carried them out without hesitation. It was a cycle of obedience passed down from one generation to the next. Even those who may have doubted kept silent, for silence was safer than defiance. The Victorian bride entered her wedding night without knowledge of what intimacy meant. Families raised their daughters to be silent, obedient, and pure, and in their world. Purity was defined by ignorance. Schools never addressed the subject. Churches warned against even the thought of desire, and mothers avoided direct conversation. A girl might know how to cook, clean, and recite prayers, but she was not permitted to understand the changes of her own body. This silence was called protection, yet it left her defenseless. In many homes, the first time a young woman even heard the word associated with sex was in hushed tones, traded among servants or whispered by curious friends. The information was fragmentary, often more frightening than helpful. Without context, rumours turned into terrifying beliefs. Some thought that the act could split a body apart, leaving wounds that would never heal. Others feared bleeding to death because no one explained the difference between myth and reality. A wedding night, instead of being a step into adulthood, became a plunge into terror. It is almost laughable that a culture so obsessed with discipline thought ignorance was safer than truth. Yet this was the accepted norm. The fear shaped everything about the night. A bride might walk into her chamber convinced she would not survive until morning. She was not encouraged to speak of these worries, for asking questions was seen as immodest. If she dared to raise the subject, she risked being labelled corrupt. Families prized silence as proof of virtue, so silence was all she had. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like sending someone into surgery without telling them what an operation is, demanding only that they lie still and trust. This ignorance also meant that the natural emotions of a young woman were suppressed. Curiosity about her body was condemned, and any sign of interest in intimacy was branded sinful. The less she knew, the more valuable she was considered. Husbands and families treated her innocence as a possession to be protected until marriage, and then to be claimed. That claim left her powerless. The very moment she needed knowledge most was the moment she had none. The result was a night filled with dread. Girls lay in bed with their hands trembling, hearts racing, and minds clouded by panic. Some fainted before anything began. Others endured without understanding what was happening. Husbands rarely offered patience, since silence was often misread as compliance. What should have been explained gently became an ordeal. The lack of education did not protect women from harm. It guaranteed it. I find it painful to imagine a teenager lying rigid on her wedding night, terrified by shadows of rumours, while those around her believed this fear was the sign of her purity. Institutions encouraged the silence. Religious leaders preached that a virtuous woman should not know about such things. Teachers avoided even the mention of reproduction, preferring to let girls remain in ignorance. Medical writers published guides that described women as naturally passive, meant only to submit. These messages reinforced one another until ignorance was not only expected but celebrated. To be uninformed was to be considered respectable, and respectability was worth more than safety. This cultural blindness continued into daily life. A married woman often did not recognize the signs of pregnancy or illness. She could not prepare herself, she could not seek advice, and she could not even describe her own condition clearly. In the first months of marriage, many lived in a fog of confusion and shame. When pain or fear arose, they hid it. To speak openly was to invite suspicion, even among close friends. Silence dominated. Ignorance was a wall that no one dared to climb. The cruelty of this system lay in its deliberate design. Families, churches, and even doctors maintained it on purpose. They believed that knowledge would corrupt and that fear was better than curiosity. The result was a cycle of obedience passed from mother to daughter, where terror was disguised as morality. Girls grew up expecting that the wedding night would be a test of survival, not an act of closeness. Their fear was considered natural, even desirable, as it proved they had not been tainted by knowledge. What was called virtue was in truth vulnerability. A girl who entered her wedding night blind was celebrated as innocent, but in reality, she was exposed to danger. The very purity society prized made her easier to control. This contradiction lay at the heart of Victorian morality, a culture that spoke of family honour while sending its daughters unprepared into situations of fear and pain. The silence left scars long after the night itself. Women carried the memory of that terror into their marriages, their pregnancies, and their friendships. It was not easily forgotten. A society that valued appearances over truth created generations of women who endured suffering in silence. The fear that began before the first night did not vanish. It lingered as a reminder of the ignorance forced upon them. The Victorian bride entered her chamber carrying fear instead of knowledge, obeying rules that demanded silence as proof of innocence. Families called it protection, but it was abandonment. In the glow of dim candles, the only certainty she had was dread. The ignorance imposed on her left every bride vulnerable, ensuring that the first night of marriage was shaped by confusion and fear. That fear, however, was only the beginning. Before she could even step fully into the chamber, she would often face another trial, one even more humiliating, where her body itself was examined and judged to prove her worth. The ordeal did not end with silence or fear. For many brides, another humiliation awaited even before the wedding chamber door closed. Families demanded proof that their daughter-in-law was untouched, and this proof had to be visible, measurable, and undeniable. Some relied on traditions involving a white cloth placed beneath the bride on the first night, to be shown the following morning to the groom's family. Others took even harsher steps, bringing doctors or midwives to examine the girl's body before the marriage was confirmed. These inspections stripped away dignity, leaving the bride reduced to a body to be measured, a possession to be verified. The white cloth ritual carried deep weight in Victorian homes. After the wedding night, the sheet or handkerchief would be inspected, sometimes in front of relatives. Blood was treated as sacred evidence, the final seal of a family contract. If the cloth remained clean, suspicion grew immediately. It was whispered that the bride was impure, that she had deceived her husband, that her family had traded damaged goods. The cruel irony was that the body does not always bleed, yet society demanded it as the only valid proof. It is almost ridiculous that a marriage could collapse over a clean sheet, but to Victorians, that cloth mattered more than the truth. Some families did not leave matters to chance. They hired physicians to perform physical examinations before the ceremony. These doctors acted not as healers but as inspectors, confirming whether a young woman was intact. A girl might be barely 15, trembling in fear, while strangers judged her worth through invasive procedures. She had no voice in this process. Her comfort, her privacy, and her dignity were dismissed entirely. What mattered was the family's honour, and her body became the battlefield where that honour was decided. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like demanding a medical certificate before marriage that declared a woman's virginity, an intrusion so degrading it would spark outrage today. The consequences of failing such a test were devastating. If no blood appeared on the cloth, or if a doctor claimed she was not untouched, the marriage could be cancelled. Families argued, reputations were ruined, and the bride carried the blame. It did not matter if the doctor erred, if the body simply reacted differently, or if the accusation was false. The shame landed squarely on her shoulders. She became the target of suspicion, humiliation, and rejection. In some cases, women were sent back to their parents as though they were defective property. The cruelty of these practices was amplified by their public nature. What should have been private became a matter of gossip and spectacle. Servants whispered, relatives speculated, and neighbours listened for signs of scandal. The bride herself was often the last to speak, and her words carried no weight. She endured in silence as others judged her. This ritual was not about truth, but about control. Families wanted assurance that their alliances were clean, and women's bodies were used to provide that assurance. The pressure to produce blood led some women to desperate measures. They scratched themselves to create wounds or enlisted servants to prepare false evidence. These acts were born not from deceit, but from fear. A clean cloth could destroy an entire life. The expectation of visible proof was so rigid that even mothers and attendants participated in staging it, believing they were saving the girl from ruin. It was not uncommon for blood to be faked with animals or dyes, anything to satisfy the demand. The fact that such measures were needed reveals how unnatural the ritual truly was. I find it disturbing to imagine families celebrating a stained cloth as proof of honour, while ignoring the suffering that produced it. These practices reflected the wider Victorian obsession with morality as performance. Purity had to be displayed, not simply lived. Families cared less about the woman's experience and more about the symbols they could present to the world. A cloth with blood, a doctor's approval, a whispered confirmation. These were treated as trophies, signs that the marriage contract was valid. Behind these symbols, the bride's body and soul were disregarded. Her worth was reduced to a fragile membrane, a detail of anatomy that decided her future. The inspection rituals also revealed the lack of trust within these unions. A marriage was not founded on love or partnership, but on suspicion and verification. Before a wife could share her life with her husband, she was treated as guilty until proven innocent. This poisoned the foundation of the relationship, placing control and fear above care and intimacy. A girl who had endured such an ordeal could not step into her new role with confidence. She entered already shamed, already doubted, already diminished. The cruelty of this system was accepted as tradition. Families repeated it without question, convinced it was necessary to protect honour. Communities reinforced it, punishing those who refused. Women lived with the knowledge that their bodies could be inspected, judged, and condemned at any moment. The rituals of proof turned the wedding night into a trial, with failure carrying the weight of social ruin. The Victorian bride did not step into marriage as an equal partner. She entered as a suspect, her innocence demanded as evidence, her value determined by the stains on a cloth or the opinion of a physician. What should have been the beginning of a life together became instead a moment of humiliation and fear. The demand for proof reduced women to objects of inspection, stripping them of privacy and dignity. A single night could decide the rest of their lives, based not on love or character, but on anatomy and appearance. And yet, this ordeal was only one stage in the cruelty of the wedding night. Once the proof was secured, the bride faced another reality that intimacy itself was not seen as a gift of love, but as a duty she owed, one she could never refuse. The Victorian wedding night was rarely described as an evening of tenderness. For most brides, it was spoken of as a duty, something owed to their husbands rather than something shared. From childhood, girls were taught that once married, they were expected to submit. Religious instruction, family advice, and medical text all repeated the same lesson: a wife's role was to yield, regardless of her own feelings. This expectation was not presented as cruelty, but as a natural order. A woman who resisted was branded disobedient, even sinful, and her refusal could be used as evidence of madness. The language of obligation shaped how women saw themselves. Marriage was not just a union, it was a contract of service. On the wedding night, this contract began with the expectation of physical surrender. A bride who hesitated risked being accused of failing in her wifely duties. Tears, fear, or reluctance did not excuse her. She was told that her body no longer belonged to her alone, but was part of what she gave in marriage. To deny her husband was to break the vows she had spoken, even if she had not understood their weight. It is almost sarcastic to note how men celebrated this as love, while women experienced it as an obligation. The idea of the wedding night as duty meant that affection was often absent. Many women endured in silence, pressing their lips together and closing their eyes as though bracing for pain. Some prayed, believing that spiritual devotion might help them endure. Others wept quietly, careful not to be heard. Husbands were told to expect obedience, not passion, so they interpreted submission as success. In this way, the cycle of silence repeated itself, with women forced to bear the burden of keeping up appearances. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like telling a patient that enduring pain without complaint is proof of good character, rather than a sign of suffering that should be eased. Medical authorities of the period often reinforced this view. Some manuals written for young wives advised them to lie still, to avoid showing interest, and to conceal their emotions. A woman who expressed enjoyment was seen as indecent. Instead, she was told to act passive, even pained, as a sign of modesty. Doctors and moralists argued that too much female desire was dangerous, and that the best wife was one who fulfilled her role without enthusiasm. These instructions stripped intimacy of tenderness and transformed it into obligation, leaving no space for love or comfort. For the bride herself, the experience could be shattering. Entering the chamber after enduring rituals of preparation and inspection, she now faced the reality of submission. Her tears were not signs of weakness, but of despair. She might feel fear, pain, or humiliation, yet all of it was expected to remain hidden. To complain was to risk being called unfit. To resist was to risk punishment. The safest choice was silence. And so silence became the hallmark of the Victorian wedding night. I cannot ignore the cruelty of imagining countless young women forced to endure such moments, stripped of choice and told to accept suffering as duty. The sense of debt placed on women extended beyond that first night. From the start, marriage was framed not as a partnership but as service. A bride's role was to sacrifice, to provide, and to endure. The wedding night was simply the first lesson in a lifetime of obligations. Love, desire, or tenderness mattered little compared to the social and religious command to obey. What was framed as moral responsibility was, in practice, a demand for control. The expectation of obedience also stripped intimacy of joy. Husbands were rarely encouraged to consider their wives' feelings, and many did not. The act became a demonstration of authority rather than an exchange of care. Some men even tested their power through force, confident that society would protect them. Laws confirmed this, as marital rape was not recognised. A wife had no legal right to refuse. Her body was legally bound to her husband, a truth reinforced by every custom and expectation surrounding the marriage bed. This system left women isolated in their suffering. Mothers often advised their daughters to accept whatever came. Friends were discouraged from speaking openly about their experiences, so no network of support could form. Each bride faced the ordeal as though she were the only one enduring it, though countless others shared the same fate. This isolation deepened the sense of despair, convincing many that their unhappiness was their own fault. The cruelty of framing the wedding night as duty rather than joy reflects the broader contradictions of Victorian society. Publicly, the culture celebrated morality, family, and progress. Privately, it allowed suffering to unfold in silence, labelling it obedience. Women's pain was hidden under the language of virtue, and their voices were dismissed as irrelevant. The duty expected of them was not love but submission, a demand that overshadowed any possibility of tenderness. For many women, the first night of marriage was remembered not as the beginning of companionship but as the start of endurance. It was the moment they learned that their feelings would always be secondary, that their role was not to be loved but to serve. In this way, the wedding night shaped not only the start of marriage but the course of life itself. The Victorian bride faced her husband with tears and trembling, her silence mistaken for consent, her suffering mistaken for virtue. What was celebrated as duty was, in truth, a theft of autonomy. The night marked the beginning of a marriage not built on love, but on power and control. The sense of duty forced upon women turned what could have been closeness into a silent burden. That burden did not end with submission. It deepened with instructions that told brides not even to express emotion. And so, while some wept quietly in their chambers, they were also told to conceal their tears, to lie still, and to act as though their own feelings did not exist. Advice given to Victorian brides on their wedding night was not about comfort, understanding, or closeness. Instead, they were told that the most proper thing to do was to lie still and remain silent. Manuals written by doctors and moralists insisted that any sign of enthusiasm from a woman was a mark of sickness. A wife who appeared to enjoy intimacy was branded immodest, corrupt, or even diseased. To avoid such accusations, young brides were instructed to suppress every natural reaction, no matter how instinctive. Their bodies were to remain motionless, their voices quiet, their faces blank. In this way, intimacy was reduced to endurance, not expression. Guides circulated through middle-class households reinforced this message. They advised wives to act as though intimacy caused them discomfort, even pain. A woman who smiled, sighed, or responded warmly risked being judged as immoral. Instead, she was told that her duty was to display restraint and even aversion. These texts carried authority because they were written by doctors, men of learning whose words were rarely questioned. For a bride who had never been taught about her own body, such instructions became law. The result was that countless women entered marriage believing that to act human was to act sinful. It is almost absurd that doctors could publish entire books teaching women to pretend to suffer. Yet in Victorian society, these were treated as serious medical advice. The expectation of silence and stillness robbed intimacy of its humanity. Husbands were not encouraged to seek connection, they were told to expect compliance. A wife who remained motionless was considered virtuous, while one who responded naturally was condemned. This created a cruel paradox. If she resisted, she was accused of disobedience. If she responded, she was accused of corruption. The only safe path was to erase herself, hiding both body and emotion beneath a mask of stillness. If we compare this to the present, it would be like telling patients that showing pain relief during treatment is shameful, and that only grimacing silently proves good character. Some brides followed the advice so literally that their wedding nights became scenes of eerie quiet. A young woman, frightened and uncertain, might lie stiffly in bed, her hands clenched, her eyes staring at the ceiling. She'd been told that to move, to touch, or to express was to risk dishonour. Husbands interpreted this lack of response in different ways, some as obedience, others as indifference, and some as resistance to be broken. The tragedy was that none of these interpretations gave the bride a voice. Her silence was not consent, but fear disguised as duty. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine women being praised for acting lifeless, while their very humanity was treated as a fault. The medical texts of the era went even further. Some included instructions on how to conceal feelings, how to breathe shallowly to appear fragile, or how to feign discomfort so that modesty would be believed. The authors argued that such behaviour proved a woman's moral strength. They portrayed endurance of unwanted acts as a virtue, almost as a religious sacrifice. This advice was passed from mothers to daughters, reinforcing the cycle. What should have been moments of learning and closeness became rehearsals in submission, drilled into women by those who claimed to know best. The cruelty of these teachings lay not only in their words, but in their acceptance. Families bought the books, read them aloud, and trusted their authority. Husbands referred to them as confirmation of what they already believed. Brides carried them like silent commandments, shaping their actions on nights that should have been filled with tenderness. The advice left no room for joy, only endurance. Women learned to perform pain as proof of virtue, a performance that harmed not only their bodies but their sense of self. This distortion of intimacy reflected the larger Victorian obsession with appearances. It was not enough for a woman to be pure, she had to look pure, even in her private life. Her emotions were treated as evidence to be judged. If she expressed too much, she was condemned. If she expressed nothing, she was praised. The system left her trapped, performing a role that denied her reality. The cost of this performance was her voice, her agency, and her ability to form genuine connections. The advice also placed women in danger. By teaching them to remain passive, it left them unable to speak when they were harmed. A wife who had been told to lie still and hide her feelings could not easily protest mistreatment. Her silence was interpreted as acceptance, even when it masked pain. In this way, the very instructions meant to ensure modesty became tools that enabled abuse. They created conditions where women were punished for being honest and rewarded for being silent. The expectation of passivity turned countless wedding nights into lonely, alienating experiences. Brides learned quickly that their bodies were not their own, and that their feelings were irrelevant. They entered marriage under a burden of the rules that denied their humanity. For many, the first lesson of married life was not love but suppression. The most personal act was transformed into a stage where women acted out suffering to satisfy society's demands. The Victorian wedding night was shaped by rituals of silence, endurance, and repression. A woman who obeyed these cruel lessons was called virtuous. A woman who resisted was called sinful. Either way, her truth was never considered. She was expected to hide her emotions, her desires, and even her pain, all in the name of modesty. By the time the candlelight dimmed and the house grew quiet, what remained in the chamber was not closeness but emptiness. A wife had been told that her greatest virtue was to be voiceless, motionless, and expressionless. And yet, beyond the silence of her chamber, another horror lingered. The entire atmosphere of the wedding room itself was crafted to resemble not celebration, but sacrifice, cloaked in dim light and suffocating stillness. The bridal chamber in a Victorian household was not arranged to inspire warmth or tenderness. It was prepared with the gravity of a ceremony, and every detail carried the weight of control. Curtains of deep red were often drawn tightly, shutting out natural light and surrounding the room with heavy shadows. Mirrors, which might have reflected the bride's nervous face, were covered with cloth, as if vanity itself was forbidden on such a night. Candles or lamps gave only a faint glow, leaving corners of the room in darkness. The atmosphere was not festive, not inviting, but oppressive. What should have been a private space of affection felt more like a place where a ritual would be performed. The silence inside the room made the effect even stronger. No music, no laughter, and no gentle words were permitted to break the tension. The quiet was not restful but suffocating, thick with expectation. A bride who entered such a room already carried fear, and the emptiness only deepened it. Instead of comfort, she felt confinement. Instead of intimacy, she felt isolation. The chamber, stripped of warmth, seemed less like a bedroom and more like a stage prepared for sacrifice. It is almost sarcastic to say that Victorians claim to value love, yet they dressed their bridal rooms as if preparing for mourning. Even outside the room, the sense of surveillance continued. Servants or attendants were often stationed nearby, tasked with keeping watch. Their presence ensured that the bride could not slip away and that the couple's privacy was never fully their own. To modern sensibilities, it is difficult to imagine beginning married life under guard, as though the act of union needed witnesses to ensure it occurred. If we compare this to the present, it would be like having security guards outside a hotel room door on a honeymoon night, a level of intrusion so invasive it borders on absurd. The decorations of the chamber were not chosen for beauty but for symbolism. Heavy drapes suggested solemnity, dim light suggested restraint, and the covered mirrors suggested denial of self. The very objects in the room reminded the bride of what was expected. Nothing was allowed to encourage joy or desire. Even the bed was often arranged with stiff linens and carefully placed sheets, waiting not to comfort but to provide evidence the following morning. Every detail reinforced the idea that the night was not hers, but society's. The oppressive silence also heightened the bride's awareness of her own vulnerability. With no distraction, no noise to soften the atmosphere, the smallest sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the flicker of a candle, the breathing of her husband beside her, all of it emphasized the weight of the moment. She could not escape into laughter, conversation, or affection. The stillness was designed to remind her of her role, to press down on her until resistance felt impossible. I find it chilling to imagine a young woman sitting in such a room, surrounded by dim shadows, knowing she was being treated not as a bride but as an offering. The chamber became another tool of control. By stripping the environment of warmth, families and traditions ensured that the bride felt powerless. She was not entering a partnership but a ritual, one where her feelings did not matter. The room itself spoke louder than any words. You're here to fulfill a duty. You cannot refuse, and you will be watched. It was a stage set for obedience, not for love. The presence of servants outside the door added another layer of fear. The bride knew that her actions, or lack of them, might be reported. If she hesitated or resisted, it could reach her family by morning. Privacy, which might have offered her comfort, was denied entirely. She was never alone, even in the most intimate of moments. This knowledge silenced her further, ensuring she had no choice but to submit. The chamber's atmosphere mirrored the broader contradictions of Victorian society. Publicly, families spoke of morality and virtue. Privately, they created spaces where women were forced into silence and fear. The wedding night was framed as sacred, but the ritual surrounding it reduced it to something harsh and mechanical. The heavy curtains, the covered mirrors, the dim lamps, and the watching servants all pointed to the same truth. This was not about love, but about control. The Victorian bridal room stripped intimacy of all tenderness. What should have been a place of closeness was instead made into a place of submission. The bride entered not as a partner, but as a figure in a ritual, her every movement restricted by silence and expectation. She was reminded, in every shadow and every glance toward the guarded door, that she belonged to others more than to herself. The chamber's atmosphere completed the transformation of marriage into duty. Surrounded by silence, shadows, and surveillance, the bride was prepared not for joy but for obedience, and once this setting had forced her into stillness, another trial awaited inside the room itself, where the husband was taught to use the night as a test of his power and dominance. The Victorian wedding night did not simply mark the beginning of marriage. For many husbands, it was treated as the moment to establish dominance. The rituals of preparation and silence had already stripped the bride of her independence, and now the husband stepped into a role where power mattered more than affection. In households where authority was the measure of manhood, the first night became a test, not of love, but of control. Husbands believed it was their right to demonstrate ownership, and the body of the bride was the place where this ownership was proved. Some men viewed the night as an opportunity to make a statement. They did not approach with care, but with force, certain that pain was proof of submission. Inflicting suffering was not seen as cruelty, but as confirmation that the bride now belonged entirely to her husband. To them, her tears or cries of discomfort were marks of success, signs that she had been conquered. It is almost grotesque to think that injury could be mistaken for intimacy, yet within Victorian homes, this was accepted as normal. The pressure on men to demonstrate control came from family, society, and even law. A husband who failed to assert himself risked being judged weak. Relatives whispered if the bride appeared confident or unshaken after the first night. Strength was measured by the degree of silence imposed on the wife. By causing pain or fear, a husband was not condemned, but praised as decisive. The night was transformed into a performance of power, one that erased the possibility of tenderness. If we compare this to the present, it would be like telling a groom that the measure of a successful wedding night is how effectively he can intimidate his bride, a standard so cruel it is unthinkable today. For the bride, this experience was devastating. After being bathed, inspected, and instructed into passivity, she was met not with kindness but with a test of endurance. If she resisted, the consequences could be immediate. Husbands had the power to strike, to send her back to her parents in disgrace, or to accuse her of failing in her duties. The family honour that had been tied to her body now hung by the thread of her obedience. She was trapped, knowing that defiance could destroy her reputation forever. The cruelty was compounded by the lack of protection. Laws recognized the husband's authority, and society supported his right to act as he pleased. A wife had no legal standing to refuse him, and no family wanted to admit that their son-in-law had overstepped. If the bride returned home, she was not treated as a victim, but as a failure. Her parents bore shame, her community whispered, and her life became marked by scandal. The threat of rejection forced many women into silence, enduring whatever came to avoid the greater punishment of disgrace. Accounts of such nights describe women weeping quietly, too afraid to speak, while their husbands treated their pain as proof of dominance. These moments were not accidents of cruelty, but deliberate acts encouraged by the values of the time. Men were told they had the right to establish their authority on the first night, and many took that right with force. What should have been the beginning of companionship became instead the ceiling of ownership, with the wife reduced to a possession. I find it haunting to imagine how many young women, barely more than girls, endured their first night of marriage not in closeness, but in pain inflicted to prove another's power. The culture that enabled such behavior is called tradition. Families did not question it, communities did not condemn it, and churches often reinforced it. The wedding night was not only personal, it was a public declaration hidden behind closed doors. Every detail was designed to demonstrate that the husband was now master. This understanding framed the rest of the marriage, ensuring that the bride began her new life already subdued. The ritual of dominance also destroyed trust before it could form. Instead of building a connection, it built fear. A wife who began her marriage under pain and threat learned quickly that her voice held no value. She entered not as a partner, but as property. From that moment on, every interaction carried the memory of that first night, shaping her silence and submission in the years that followed. In the larger picture, the wedding night as a test of control reflected the Victorian obsession with hierarchy. Authority had to be proven, reinforced, and displayed. A man who dominated his wife was not seen as cruel, but as successful. This mentality extended beyond the bedroom, shaping the household, the family, and the community. Power was valued more than care, and ownership more than love. For women, the result was lasting. Many never spoke of their first nights, carrying the pain quietly into their daily lives. The silence that had been imposed before marriage continued afterward, reinforced by the memory of tears dismissed as proof of obedience. A night that could have been remembered as tender became instead an introduction to fear, a fear that lingered with every demand and every command. The Victorian wedding night was thus not simply a private event but a demonstration of power. Husbands proved themselves through dominance, and brides learned their role through pain. It was a ritual that left women silenced, husbands emboldened, and marriages founded on fear. The husband's assertion of control turned the bridal chamber into a stage of ownership, where the woman's pain was used as proof of possession. And even when the night ended, her ordeal did not, for by morning she was expected to produce evidence of her suffering in the form of blood on a cloth, displayed as public proof of her so-called purity. The morning after a Victorian wedding was not always filled with celebration. For many brides, it was filled with dread, for their honour rested not on their character, but on a piece of cloth. The white sheet or handkerchief placed beneath them on the wedding night was expected to bear blood, visible proof that they had been untouched before marriage. Families, servants, and sometimes even entire communities awaited the evidence. The absence of blood was treated not as a medical fact, but as a moral failure. A clean cloth could ruin a reputation, end a marriage, or cast suspicion over an entire family. The expectation was cruel because it ignored reality. Not every woman bled, and not every marriage act left a trace. Yet Victorian society demanded a visible sign. Without it, whispers began immediately. Was the bride truly pure? Had she deceived her husband? Had her family hidden shame behind a ceremony? These questions, voiced or unspoken, placed unbearable weight on a young woman who had already endured silence, inspection, and submission. It is almost absurd that a life's worth of reputation could be judged by stains on a piece of fabric. Yet Victorians treated it as sacred truth. Some brides, fearing the consequences, took matters into their own hands. They scratched themselves, creating small wounds to smear blood onto the cloth. Others used sharp objects, desperate to produce the proof that society demanded. The pain they inflicted was not for themselves, but for survival, a way to protect their place in their new household. The cruelty lay in the fact that no one questioned why such measures were necessary. Instead, the presence of blood was praised as confirmation of virtue, no matter how it appeared. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like demanding a certificate of pain after marriage, a requirement so degrading and irrational it seems unthinkable today. Servants often played a hidden role in this ritual. A trusted maid might slip animal blood or prepared stains onto the cloth, ensuring that the family honour remained intact. These acts were rarely spoken of openly, but they were common enough to be an open secret. Servants, too, understood the stakes. If the bride failed, their household bore the shame as well. By providing false proof, they believed they were protecting not only the bride but their own livelihood. The deception was less about trickery and more about survival in a society that demanded impossible evidence. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining a young girl waking after her wedding night, her fate dependent on whether a servant could smear enough red onto a cloth to satisfy tradition. the display of the blood-stained sheet was often ritualized. Families showed it to mothers-in-law, to relatives, and in some cases to neighbours. It was paraded as though it were a trophy, proof that the marriage was valid. The bride herself had no voice in this process. She was reduced to silence once more, her worth decided by what others saw, not by who she was. Even if she had endured pain, humiliation, or even violence the night before, none of that mattered. What mattered was the cloth, and the cloth spoke louder than she ever could. The cruelty of this ritual reflected a deeper obsession with appearances. Families cared more about what could be displayed than about the truth. Honour was treated as a public performance, and the bride's body was the stage. If blood appeared, the performance succeeded. If it did not, the performance failed, and the consequences were brutal. Women who failed this test could be cast out, beaten, or returned to their parents in disgrace. Their lives could be ruined by a detail of anatomy that society refused to understand. The expectation of blood also reinforced the husband's authority. By demanding proof, he confirmed his ownership. The sheet or handkerchief became a contract, signed not with ink but with pain. The marriage was sealed through a ritual that left the woman diminished. Her suffering was not hidden, it was displayed, celebrated, and judged. In this way, the private act of intimacy was transformed into a public examination, a cruel distortion of what marriage should have been. This obsession with proof poisoned the foundations of trust. A marriage that began with suspicion, inspection, and display could hardly foster closeness. Instead, it fostered fear. The bride learned that her body was evidence, her worth conditional, and her future uncertain. She could not step into marriage with confidence, for she knew that every gesture and every silence might be interpreted against her. The stained cloth ritual revealed the contradictions of Victorian morality. A society that spoke of virtue demanded deception. Families that claimed to value honesty celebrated false evidence. Women who sought survival were forced to injure themselves or rely on others to save them from shame. The system did not protect purity. It punished honesty and rewarded fear. For many women, the memory of that first morning remained vivid long after. They remembered the anxiety, the pain, and the relief or despair when the cloth was revealed. It became a symbol not of love but of control, not of union but of judgment. The blood on the sheet was not a natural sign of purity but a manufactured mark of survival. The white cloth, meant to sanctify the marriage, became instead a symbol of humiliation and fear. Brides learned that their worth was displayed on linen, their reputations hanging by threads of red or white. And even when the ritual ended, their suffering did not, for some husbands and families went further still, turning to tools and chemicals, bringing objects and substances into the chamber to ensure submission in even more disturbing ways. The cruelty of the Victorian wedding night did not end with silence, blood-stained cloths, or the husband's assertion of control. For some families and physicians, even these measures were not enough. They sought to manage the ordeal with substances and tools that turned the chamber into something closer to a sick room than a place of intimacy. Doctors of the period sometimes suggested mild anaesthetics to quiet a bride's resistance. Ether or chloroform could be used to dull her senses, ensuring she remained passive while the act was carried out. To those who endorsed it, this was framed as kindness, a way to reduce fear. In truth, it stripped away the last element of choice, leaving the woman unconscious while her body was taken. Other advisers went further, proposing instruments that they claimed would make the process easier. Crude dilators and metal devices were offered as assistance, tools to force the body open rather than waiting for it to respond naturally. These implements, cold and mechanical, were presented as solutions to a problem that only existed because brides were denied knowledge, choice, and time. Husbands who lacked patience were encouraged to see medicine and instruments as acceptable replacements for care. The result was a marriage bed filled not with tenderness, but with the harshness of tools that belonged in a surgeon's kit. It is almost grotesque to think that what should have been symbols of love were replaced by bottles of ether and devices of steel. Yet Victorian society allowed this to happen. Families sometimes prepared in advance, keeping bandages and cloth soaked in alcohol or ether outside the chamber door. Servants were instructed to be ready in case of bleeding, fainting, or hysteria. The bridal chamber became a site of anticipated injury, stocked with supplies as though harm was expected. This preparation revealed the truth: the wedding night was not imagined as a moment of joy, but as a medical emergency waiting to happen. The bride herself had no say in these measures. She entered a room already set up to treat her not as a partner, but as a patient to be subdued. If we compare this to the present, it would be like packing a honeymoon suite with surgical gloves and sedatives, an intrusion so chilling it would erase any idea of romance. For the bride, these measures added another layer of terror: the scent of ether on a cloth, the sight of bandages ready at hand, the mention of strange instruments, all reminded her that she was about to be harmed. She knew nothing of medicine and had no power to refuse it. Whether she was held still, made to breathe vapours, or pressed open by metal, her body was treated as an object to be managed. Families justified it as protection, but it was protection for reputation, not for her safety or dignity. The medicalization of the wedding night shows how deeply society has normalized suffering. Instead of questioning why brides resisted or feared, doctors and families looked for ways to silence and subdue them. Resistance was not treated as a natural fear, but as a problem to be solved with drugs and tools. Pain was not considered a sign of cruelty, but a step in the process, expected and prepared for. The presence of ether and instruments made the chamber not only frightening but clinical, stripping away any remaining illusion of intimacy. I find it horrifying to imagine a young bride inhaling ether while her family waited outside, believing this was the proper way to begin a marriage. The acceptance of these practices also reinforced the imbalance of power. A husband could justify his actions by pointing to medical advice, claiming he was following the recommendations of learned men. Families could defend their choices by citing doctors who endorsed such measures. The authority of medicine, rather than protecting women, was twisted to excuse their suffering. In this way, even science became a tool of control, its language used to silence the cries of those who had no voice. The wedding night thus became not only a ritual of submission, but also a rehearsal of medical cruelty. The tools and drugs present in the chamber foreshadowed the wider ways in which Victorian women were treated by institutions that claimed to care for them. Their pain was dismissed, their resistance drugged, their bodies forced to comply. What should have been private and tender was transformed into something invasive and cold. For many women, memories of their wedding night were marked by the scent of chemicals, the sight of bandages, and the knowledge that they had been subdued not by love but by force disguised as medicine. These practices did not protect them, they ensured their silence. The presence of anesthetics, instruments, and prepared supplies turned the first night of marriage into something closer to a procedure than an act of union. It stripped away dignity and choice, leaving women bound by fear and control. And yet, the ordeal did not end with these tools. By the following morning, the bride was expected to rise, smile, and face her family as though nothing had happened, even while her body and spirit carried the weight of the night. The morning after the Victorian wedding night was not one of rest or quiet recovery. It was a staged continuation of the ritual, with the bride forced to present herself as cheerful, no matter what she had endured hours before. Eyes still swollen from tears, body aching from fear or injury. She was expected to rise early, dress carefully, and greet her new household with smiles. To falter, to show distress, would invite suspicion. Families demanded that she play the role of the happy wife, and her performance was judged as closely as the stained cloth lying in the chamber behind her. In many homes, the first task of the morning was the inspection of the marriage bed. Sheets were carried out, sometimes in front of relatives, and examined for proof of blood. The results determined the tone of the day. If the cloth bore the expected stains, the bride was praised, her family congratulated, and her honour declared intact. If not, the atmosphere shifted instantly to suspicion, whispers, and even open confrontation. The bride herself had no chance to explain. Her worth was decided in silence, by evidence displayed on linen. It is almost ridiculous to think that a young woman's future could hang on what appeared, or failed to appear, on a bedsheet. Yet this was treated as a solemn truth. In some households, this ritual extended into a public celebration. Families arranged breakfast where the success of the night was quietly confirmed. Servants whispered among themselves. Relatives exchanged knowing looks, and the bride was paraded as though she had accomplished some noble task. Food was laid out, drinks poured, and congratulations offered. For the young woman who had suffered in silence only hours before, the forced smiles were another burden. She could not share her fear, her pain, or her humiliation. She could only sit, surrounded by relatives, pretending that joy filled her heart. If we compare this to modern customs, it would be like hosting a brunch the morning after a wedding where guests expect to be shown medical proof of intimacy before raising their glasses, a practice so invasive it seems beyond belief today. The cruelty of this ritual lay in its demand for performance. The bride's suffering was ignored, her emotions erased, and her role reduced to smiling while her private life was displayed. No one asked how she felt. No one offered comfort or care. Instead, she was treated as evidence of a contract fulfilled. Her body and her silence used to reassure the family's reputation. She had been reduced from person to proof, and her ability to endure was celebrated more than her well-being. I find it unsettling to imagine a young woman forced to sit at a breakfast table with trembling hands and a forced smile, while the people around her quietly judged the stains on her sheets. For the bride, the morning after was as humiliating as the night itself. She knew that eyes followed her every movement, searching for signs of weakness or guilt. If she looked too weary, relatives whispered that something was wrong. If she seemed too calm, they suspected deceit. She was trapped in a narrow space where only one performance was acceptable: cheerful submission. Anything else could threaten her standing in the household and her future as a wife. The stage celebration also reinforced the power of the husband. His role was never questioned, his behaviour never inspected. The focus rested entirely on the bride, her body, and her blood. The imbalance was clear, yet no one spoke of it. To question the ritual was to question tradition itself, and so it continued, repeated across households as though it were sacred. This cruel custom stripped the wedding morning of tenderness. Instead of sharing private time with her husband, the bride found herself thrust into a performance for her family and community. She was expected to bear her suffering silently, smile on command, and participate in a celebration that mocked her pain. What should have been a moment of privacy became another act of public scrutiny. For many women, the memory of that morning lingered as strongly as the night before. The smell of food, the murmur of relatives, the forced smiles, all of it stayed with them as reminders that their bodies were never truly their own. Marriage had begun not as a partnership, but as a display. Not as love, but as judgment. The morning ritual confirmed that the wedding night was not an isolated ordeal, but part of a larger cycle of humiliation. From the cloth to the breakfast table, every detail reinforced the message that the bride existed to serve as evidence, not as a person. Her role was to prove, to smile, and to remain silent, no matter what had happened behind closed doors. The forced celebration of the morning after stripped away any illusion of safety or relief. A bride might hope the night's ordeal was over, but daylight only brought fresh humiliation. And even as she smiled through her exhaustion, she faced another cruel reality. Many of these brides were still children, their bodies unready for what had been forced upon them. The reality of child brides in Victorian society was one of the darkest aspects of marriage customs. Girls as young as 14 or 15 were often married off, their youth erased by the weight of tradition and family expectation. To the families arranging these marriages, it was practical alliances were secured, dowries exchanged, and reputations safeguarded. To the community, it was acceptable, even respectable, as long as appearances were maintained. But to the girls themselves, it was a brutal end to childhood. They were thrust into adult roles before their bodies, minds, or emotions could withstand them. These young brides were prepared in the same way as older women. They were bathed, dressed in white, and led through rituals of purity. Yet beneath the surface, they were still children. Their shoulders were narrow, their hips undeveloped, their minds filled more with fear than understanding. They had not been taught what marriage truly meant, only that it was their duty to obey. When the wedding night arrived, they stepped into the chamber without knowledge or preparation, their innocence twisted into a weapon against them. It is almost grotesque that Victorian society equated purity with ignorance and celebrated the destruction of childhood as virtue. The physical consequences of such marriages were devastating. Medical reports of the time, though discreet, mention cases of young brides suffering torn wombs, ruptures, and uncontrollable bleeding. Their small frames were simply not ready for what was forced upon them. Many endured lifelong damage, some becoming infertile, others living with chronic pain. Infection claimed many lives, yet their deaths were explained away as illness or weakness, never as the result of being forced into marriage too soon. Families avoided shame by hiding the truth, and so the cycle continued. If we compare this to today, it would be like allowing a high school student to face childbirth, with her body unprepared and her survival uncertain, a thought that shocks us now but was tolerated then. The psychological toll was no less severe. Girls carried into strange homes, expected to serve husbands far older than themselves, often collapsed under the weight of fear. With no understanding of intimacy, they interpreted their wedding nights as violence, and in many cases, they were not wrong. Some fainted from terror, others wept until exhaustion overtook them. Instead of comfort, they were met with demands. Their cries were dismissed as immaturity, their terror seen as natural proof of innocence. What society considered desirable was, in truth, trauma written across their faces. I find it heartbreaking to picture a teenager lying stiff in a bridal chamber, her body trembling, while the family outside toasted what they believed was a noble union. Pregnancy was another consequence these girls were forced to bear. Within months of marriage, many were expected to produce children. Their bodies, still growing, struggled with the strain. Adolescent mothers faced high risks of death during childbirth, and those who survived often carried injuries that marked them for life. Obstetric fistulas, hemorrhage, and permanent weakness were common. Infants born to such young mothers also faced high mortality rates. What was celebrated as the continuation of family honour was, in reality, the destruction of both mothers and children. Society's silence allowed this cruelty to persist. Communities congratulated families, churches blessed the unions, and medical professionals rarely intervened. Even when tragedies occurred, blame was directed not at the custom, but at fate, or at the supposed frailty of the bride. Families turned away from the truth, preferring to believe that early marriage was moral and safe. By denying the harm, they ensured its repetition, condemning countless girls to the same suffering. The hypocrisy of the Victorian obsession with innocence is stark. Girls were valued precisely because they were unready, because they had no experience and no voice. Their youth was treated as an asset, their lack of knowledge proof of worth. This turned their vulnerability into a commodity, traded in exchange for security or reputation. In the process, their individuality was erased, and their futures were decided before they had even begun. Those who survived the ordeal rarely forgot it. Memories of their wedding nights lingered for decades, shaping their marriages with fear and silence. The trauma resurfaced in moments of intimacy, in pregnancies, and in childbirth. Many withdrew emotionally, unable to reconcile the image of marriage as holy with their own experience of it as violent. Their pain remained unspoken, yet it shaped the rhythm of their lives. The cruelty of child marriage was not hidden, but normalized. Families called it protection, society called it morality, and the church called it sanctity. But for the girls themselves, it was a sentence, stripping away their childhood and branding their suffering as duty. To call it tradition was to disguise the violence it inflicted. The Victorian child bride was denied the chance to grow into adulthood before being claimed by marriage. She endured physical harm, psychological terror, and the silence of a society that praised her suffering as virtue. What was hailed as honour was, in reality, the exploitation of the most vulnerable. The story of these young brides makes clear that marriage in the Victorian era was not about love or choice, but about control and reputation. Their innocence, which should have been shielded, was instead the very